The greatest thing in Michigan is to be a child of God. Well, now half of you were awake. Do me a favor. Let's all get awake for a moment. The greatest thing in Michigan is to be a child of God. Amen. I knew I would say something this morning that you would agree with. It's so good to have everyone out this morning. I'm glad that you're here. Today we're going to be talking about the subject of citizenship, and we're going to be looking at the passage that was read just a moment ago. But before I get there, one of my dad's favorite entertainers when we were growing up, he loved to listen to Will Rogers. And those of you who are older know that name. Those of you who are younger don't even know who I'm talking about, and that's okay. But Will Rogers was a native of Oklahoma. He came from a very obscure background. He emerged as one of the greatest men of his generation, known by everyone as a great entertainer, a great humorist, who could tell stories and have people laughing and get a point across at the very same time. And people just loved him, and he wasn't just a teller of jokes, because behind his stories, a lot of times there was some philosophical thought behind them, and he would puncture the bubbles of some of the self-important people of his day. And he would hold up, to public view some of the fallacies of life that he had saw and that he wanted to share with other people and cause them to think about it. His newspaper column, by the way, ran for years and years and years, and I think there's still some today that still carry his column, because his humor speaks to our time as much as it did to his time. He was a religious man. He was proud to be an American citizen. He was a man who was not afraid to do what is right when culture around him tried to put pressure to do things otherwise. One of his favorite friends was a preacher from California, which he used to call his adopted state. And in all of his public humor, he never once told a dirty joke. Not ever once. Now, when we think of comedians today, you just have to shake your head. On one occasion, there was a man who was introducing him at a dinner that he was to speak at in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he introduced Will Rogers with a dirty, smutty story on purpose, because he just wasn't that kind of a man. So when Will Rogers got up, he decided that he would put the man in his place, and he said this. He said, "I have entertained audiences all over the world, including sometimes royalty, but I've never done so by telling a dirty joke." You have to admire a man like that. But I want to go back centuries before America was discovered by the Europeans, and thousands of miles away from the American shore, because I want to take your mind back to one day in the life of Paul, who was an apostle of Jesus Christ. It's kind of interesting because you and I have one days. Today is one day in our lives, one day in the life of a person who wants to serve Christ. And this event, this day, is recorded for us in Acts chapter 22. And Paul was falsely charged by some Jewish enemies there with taking a Gentile into the temple, past the courts of the Gentiles where he might have been allowed. And that precipitated a riot. People got super upset about this, and had not the Roman commander in the nearby tower of Antonia rescued him, he might have been torn from limb to limb and died this day. Now, thinking that Paul was a troublemaker, an insurrectionist, the Roman commander was going to have him whipped. And Paul, being stretched out, ready to be beaten, reminded that those who were assigned to the task of beating him, he says, it's unlawful, isn't it, to scourge a Roman citizen. And when they heard that, they went back to the chief captain and they told him that he's a Roman citizen. And he came down to Paul and he said to him, "Are you a Roman citizen?" Wow. Citizenship is a prized status. Citizenship carries something with it. And the officer, who was also a Roman citizen, said, "Well, I bought my citizenship for a large sum of money." And Paul says, "I was born a Roman citizen." Now, you know, a person might have become a Roman citizen in three ways then. One, you could purchase it if you were rich enough and had enough money to where you could buy your Roman citizenship. Sometimes it would be presented as a gift to those who had done something special for the Roman Empire. And thirdly, you could be born and your father be a Roman citizen, so you automatically became a Roman citizen. But citizenship is a prized status in that day. If you were a Roman citizen, there were certain things that you had that those who were not Roman citizens didn't have. It's pretty much like today, if you travel around the world, and Pat and I have had an opportunity on a couple occasions, and you learn real quickly that American citizenship is a prized possession, not only in our minds, but also in the minds of people in foreign countries. Oh, you're American, you're from the USA. There is a value to citizenship. And I couldn't help but think about that on July 4th when the fireworks are all going off and my puppy's trying to understand whether she likes it or doesn't like it. And people celebrating the birthday of our nation. And yet, you know, the question comes up, if you stop and think about it, just who is an American? Because so many of us take being an American citizen for granted, and sometimes we even abuse our citizenship, but it's coveted by multitudes of people outside our nation. You know, American travelers sometimes are told that when you go off into another country, really take care of your passport. Don't leave it laying around. Don't have it out of your sight, because a lot of times they're stolen, they're altered, and people use them to come into our country illegally. And for my own part, and when Pat and I too, when we left the United States and come back, you never not think, I am so grateful to be back to the USA. I remember reading about one man who said that every time he traveled in a foreign country and he would come back, he said he felt like kissing the ground, but he didn't. But he said, I would rush to the first water cooler I found and drink a whole bunch of water, realizing that that water would not make me ill. I'm not trying to belittle in your thinking other nations in any way whatsoever, because just like our country, every country has pluses and minuses. I'm only saying that most of us sitting here, if we were asked, we're very happy, we're very proud to be an American. And any person who is a citizen of any country in the Western Hemisphere technically is an American, but somehow we call those in Mexico Mexicans and those in Canada Canadians, and we've kind of narrowed down America to people who are citizens of the United States. But I'm not thinking about just someone who's been born to American parents, and though most of us that's the case. I'm talking about the spirit and the thinking that embodies the lives of people who are Americans. And a lot of people fail to live up to that spirit, that ideal is something that we should strive for, because one of the things, an American is a free person. This nation of ours was born out of the will to be free. People desiring, not being restricted, not being told what to do and how to do it. They wanted the freedom right here. And those who went before us a long time ago, let me take you back to your history class, okay? There was a document that was written, and it was written about freedom. And it cost them their blood. It's being preserved by the blood of individuals all the way down through the years. And so you and I can so easily say that we have the freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and freedom of speech and freedom of religion and the exercise thereof. And all of these are guaranteed to you and I because they're in the First Amendment of the Constitution. American is a free person. And despite sometimes the encroachments of governmental power, Americans still enjoy the greatest freedom of any people on earth. And we sit here with it. It's who we are. And as Americans, you and I can work and live and travel within the boundaries of the United States without the necessity of securing a pass or permission from any agency of government. But we need to remember something always, and that is that freedom also carries a responsibility as well as its privileges. If we fail to assume the responsibility, we endanger our privileges. We're a responsible people. A free press ought to print news, not propaganda, or screaming headlines to increase circulation somehow. And you and I know that the same printing press that prints Bibles can also go out and be used to print pornography or other subversive literature. And so the Bible safeguards the nation and the other undermines it. And free speech, should be exercised constructively, not destructively. The freedom of assembly that we so much enjoy ought to be exercised within legal bounds designed to protect the rights of all. And such should not be perverted into mob violence. Freedom of religion doesn't mean freedom from religion. Anybody can be an atheist if they so choose. But there was a man who was right who said that patriotism is the highest principle of his religion, including regular Bible study and public as well as private worship. Because you see, he based that thought on a passage that we all know so well. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. But it's interesting, we need to heed the words and think about the freedom that we have for a moment, because I like what Charles Kingsley said. There are two freedoms. The false, where a man is free to do what he likes, and the true, where a man is free to do what he ought. And we make those decisions each and every day. It's how we live out our lives here. It also coincides with the words that Jesus gives us in John 8 when he says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And then later he says, "Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed." Americans are free people. Free like no one on earth. And any exercise of my freedom that infringes upon yours is an abuse of the innate nature of responsible freedom. Wendell Winkie said, "Now, more than ever, we must keep in the forefront of our minds the fact that whenever we take away the liberties of those whom we hate, we're opening the way to loss of liberty for those whom we love." We're free people, free to do right, free to do wrong, free to do what we ought to do, but also free to do what we shouldn't do, because we're free people. See, an American is also somebody who lives under a government of law and not of men. I thought it was really interesting that every person, no matter what they're charged with, in our day and age, they have a right for their day in court. They have a right to be judged by their peers under the law and by rules of evidence rather than the whim or the fancy of some fallible person. And a man is or should be considered innocent until he's proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. You guys watch TV too? They say those things because we're Americans. And we live in a country where we're citizens of America. But also, this privilege under law entails a responsibility for you and I to be law-abiding citizens. I should obey the law as a matter of principle, not merely as an expediency, not just obeying the law when some policeman is watching me, but I'm to be this law-abiding person right here. Romans 13, and I wish we had time to talk about it. It's a difficult passage to go through, but it still says there, "Let every soul be subject unto higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." God created government. You and I are blessed to be born where we are and to be the citizens of the United States right here. But the chapter goes on and says that whosoever therefore resists the power, resists the ordinance of God. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. Therefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. Dictatorships are the rule of men. Totalitarianism is weak, and therefore it doesn't give rights to the people who are its subjects. But democracy grants rights to people because it's strong. There's a quote that I came across by Thomas E. Dewey, who says that in the moral battle that engulfs the world, we must make firm our faith that the voluntary association of informed, free men is stronger than any police-whipped multitude. Think about some of the nations that you know about where they're being controlled by armies. And people are being made to do what some leader wants them to do, whether they want to or not. We live in a free country. And it's amazing to me that, that we live in a country that we sometimes forget that we also have so many freedoms. Freedoms that you and I enjoy and take for granted. For example, American is a person with freedom of opportunity to achieve the goal of his dreams. Do you realize how much you and I get to do what we want to do because we dream about it right here? But to do that, we've got to be willing to pay the price of sweat and sacrifice and toil, because success is not passed out on silver platters to those sitting around doing nothing. It's for those who are willing to labor and to scale the ladder of achievement. It's interesting that in recent years we keep hearing about how that people are like they are because of their environment. People are like they are because, they've had such many struggles when they were growing up. Matter of fact, we're even told that criminals today are created by the society. They're just victims of their social environment. I love what one doctor out in Oklahoma City said. He says, "I get so tired of hearing that I came out of such an underprivileged environment. I determined by God's help to rise above my environment so that I might be a help to, not a parasite on society in which I live." All of us have read about people who have become successful in so many different fields of endeavor, but they've come out of difficult circumstances to get to where they're at. That their childhood wasn't one of plenty or one of all kinds of wealth and stuff, but they're kind of related to Brooke Hayes, who was a former U.S. congressman who now is a professor at a large university. He said, "I was born in a depression. We always had a depression in my family as I grew up, but it was not so bad until hard times came along." Life wasn't easy in the beginning for him, and nor was it for most of us. Some struggled more than others, and we saw other families who struggled worse than our family. And I love the story of Sam Moore, who was president of Thomas Nelson Publishing Company, and he was a Lebanese. And he came here from Lebanon. He came to the United States as a young man to get an education. And his father was wealthy enough to give him his education, back home. But he wanted to be out on his own, and he wanted to do it himself. So his father gave him the best advice that he could. He says, when you go to the United States, he says, be honest, work hard, and don't be afraid to take a chance. His first job in school in this country was working as a dining hall waiter for 35 cents an hour, he said. Later, he got an opportunity to work at a filling station, and all of a sudden, he got jumped to 75 cents an hour when he was working there. And when he graduated, he started his own small publishing business, and eventually it grew to where he purchased Thomas Nelson Publishers, which at that time was one of the largest in the United States. In relating his experience, he said this: "Only in America can a man find his way through school and make a life. Only in America." He concluded by saying in that speech that America is the greatest country in the world. It's time to stop complaining and teach our children what a great country it is. Finally, an American is someone who has a spiritual heritage. Somebody said that a man's country is not a certain area of land or of mountains or of rivers and woods, but it's a principle. And patriotism is loyalty to that principle. One preacher wrote one time about how he was on a plane trip back from a meeting that he had held, and by chance, he thought, but maybe not, he was assigned a seat next to a man who was an ambassador from a foreign country. They got talking in their trip as they were flying along, going to their next destination, and the ambassador to this foreign nation said to him, "The United States is the greatest nation on earth. It has no equal in industry and the production of material products. However, you Americans are exporting the wrong things." He says, your nation has a spiritual quality the world needs far more than your material goods. That's someone on the outside looking in at us and saying, we're missing it. We're missing the best thing that we have to share. Probably the very thing God wants us to share. To one another and to those around the world. The spiritual quality is not just political freedom, but it's faith. It's a faith that we have in God and in human dignity. And I like the words of Theodore Parker, who says, this is what I call the American ideal, the government of a people, by the people, for the people, a government of principles of eternal justice and unchanging laws of God. And then it was Arthur Vandenberg, who was a Michigan U.S. Senator for a long time, and if you're real old, you probably remember his name. But he said this, he says, if America ever sags, the world's hopes sag with it. I trust that those of us who have lived in the United States all of our lives stop at least once a year when we celebrate our country's birthday and become conscious once again of all the privileges and the responsibilities we have of being American citizens. May we stop and in gratitude bow before God, thanking Him for our blessings and our heritage. May we stand strong against any vices and any dangers that arise in our country. May we support and applaud all men and women who desire to live godly in this land, so that the rest of the world around us can see and maybe want to know God and to follow His will. I leave you with this. We're not just American citizens. Those of us who have accepted to put on Christ are heavenly citizens too. And I think we know which citizenship is the most important. I love the passage, and I close with this. Philippians says, our citizenship is in heaven, for which we also eagerly wait for the Savior, our Lord Jesus Christ. This dual citizenship is part of those who have said yes to Jesus Christ. It might be this morning that Jesus' invitation is still out there before you, and Jesus is simply saying, follow me. And if you desire to do that, we ask you to come. While we as a church stand to sing to encourage you, will you come?